Welcome to the Reinvent Nuclear Security series, where this week we're going to be looking at new media to attract new audiences. I'm Pete Leiden, and I'm the founder of Reinventors. Now, we're coming to the end of this series, in which we've been gathering innovators from all kinds of diverse backgrounds, diverse fields, to really apply themselves to thinking about how could we more fundamentally reinvent the fields of nuclear proliferation and nuclear arms control. Now, some of the roundtables, we've had 4 of them put before this. This is the 5th one out of 6. Some of the roundtables have been more inward looking. For example, one in which we looked really at how we could really fundamentally rethink the missions of the 3 national nuclear weapons labs, for example. But this one's definitely going to be an outward-facing one. And we're really going to be looking here at what can be done to get more people better aware of the big, very important issues surrounding nuclear weapons. And to do this, you're going to be in very capable hands here with Erica Gregory, who's the host of the series, and she's also the executive director of N Square. And N Square is a new organization. It's backed by 5 of the largest peace and security funders in the United States, and for that matter in the world. It's the MacArthur Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Plowshares Fund, and the Skoll Global Threats Fund. But before I actually turn it over to Erica, I want to say one thing is that as smart as all these folks are in this roundtable, nobody's as smart as everybody. And we do encourage those who are watching to add your questions and comments. If you're in the Reinventors environment, you can put them in the comments section there. We'll have people watching that. If you're in the G+, Google+ environment, there's a special area there for asking questions. And if you're on Twitter, just use the hashtag Reinventors. We have folks watching that. And if it's relevant to the conversation, we'll swing it in when we can. And if not, we certainly will use it in our final package of write-ups and videos, which will come by the end of the week. So we encourage you to do that. We really value your input and hope you do so. So Erica, why don't you take it now for the 90-minute session? Oops, you're muted.
Great, thanks, Pete. This has been a very exciting last few sessions, and we're really looking forward to today. And I want to just echo what Pete said, which is that our whole mission at N Square in the first months of this initiative is to generate as broad and diverse a set of ideas as possible. So please weigh in if you're watching, and know that we have programs going on right now at TED Active. We have various people who are weighing in from around the world with their ideas and perspectives, so please join us. So today, we're particularly looking to uncover some ideas about the future of nuclear security as it pertains to new media. And we think it's a particularly important subject right now. This is the exact moment historically where we should be looking at new media channels, because we think they're an underutilized opportunity to catalyze new and diverse audiences, particularly in the run-up to the 70th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki this fall in 2015, and in the beginning of the next presidential election cycle. And of course, we don't even need to say, but this is a period of heightened global tensions. And so the more people who are thinking and talking and inventing about nuclear security right now, the better. So with that, I'm going to suggest we turn to meeting all of the folks who are in our conversation today. And then we'll wrap up by introducing Emma from the MacArthur Foundation, who will tell us a little bit more about what we're doing here. So with that, let me start with Dante, and then we'll go to Erica and Farshad. Dante. Okay, let's go ahead and start with Erica.
Yeah, right.
Hi, everybody. My name is Erica Priggen Wright, and I'm the executive producer here at Free Range Studios. And I was really looking forward to joining this roundtable because this is an issue that Free Range has been working on to some degree over the last few years. And we recently did a collaboration with an organization and campaign called Global Zero, which is working really rigorously to end nuclear proliferation. And we partnered with them on a campaign that had a lot of different touch points that we worked on, that was specifically to kind of take the early stage of their campaign and organizational development, which was really focused on kind of political elites and trying to get the messaging to that audience in a way that was really specific and targeted, and then really branching out though to reach millennials and to reach general population audiences with this message. And I have lots of thoughts and things to share on this topic from our project and process of collaborating with Global Zero, but it was really powerful to see how we could do storytelling and different kinds of media touch points on this topic to help bring in a younger audience, which really, don't necessarily have this issue front of mind. And I personally, grew up. I was in elementary school in the 80s, and I remember, the Cold War as a significant part of my childhood, and sort of lying in bed in New York City, hearing airplanes fly overhead at night, and thinking, oh my gosh, is this thing that the teachers talk about in school, where this thing is going to happen that we're all so scared of. So I have my own particular sort of personal ingrained memory of what it's been like to think about this topic over the course of my lifetime, but it's very interesting to try to message around it to people who don't necessarily have as salient a touch point with something historically like that. So further thoughts on that as we go, but I'm excited to be here and happy to be part of this roundtable.
Thanks so much, Erica. There's lots that we're going to want to come back to in what you just said. So for now, we'll go to Dante Stallworth, and then we'll go to Farshad.
Hi, my name is Dante Stallworth. I'm a National Security Fellow. I am also a former NFL player of 10 years. And I first became interested in the nuclear weapons, the issue of nuclear weapons, I would say around 2008, 2009. And I saw, and there was a lot of information in there which I was not privy to before. I had no idea of how close we were after the Cold War, how legitimately close we were to having another nuclear explosion, and not because of war, but because of accidental, or because of error, or because of a misjudgment or miscalculation. So that really caught my attention, and I think that's the major issue that I've really tried to jump into, not only since I've been working in journalism, but also when I was still playing in the NFL. I would send that DVD to guys for them to watch, and they were really shocked about it. And it's something that I think that needs a lot more attention. And the youth of today, the millennials as they're called, and even people a little bit older who weren't around, who weren't born when the whole Cold War was coming to a close and when the Berlin Wall fell, I think it has become something that a lot of people's minds with the rise of terrorism since then, and a lot of other issues that people are really paying attention to. But this issue needs just as much as attention as the others, because it is a lot more catastrophic. It's not as probable, but as we've heard in that film as well, that low probability events do happen. So it's something that needs more attention and more awareness, and I hope that we can do that here today.
So Dante, there are a couple of things I want to make sure that you talk further about, and of course one of the things is this question of how we get the world to care about something that's extraordinarily important, but as you say, low probability. We're gonna pull on that strand a little bit, but also I want to hear a little bit more about the media experience that you had that brought you to this issue. So we'll come back to that. For now, Farshad, let's turn to you, and then John and MJ.
How are you? My name is Farshad Farahat. I grew up in Tehran. I lived through the chemical bombings of Saddam Hussein, and the experience of weapons of mass destruction destroys the fabric of a society from so many angles. So that is one of the main reasons I'm here, because I felt the pain of weapons used, especially unconventional weapons, on a mass society. So that really brought me to this topic. I grew up mainly in America, here in California. I'm an actor in Hollywood. I worked in films like Argo and 300. I just recently finished State of Affairs with NBC, and everything I do seems to be in the Middle East conflict. I joined the Plowshares Board in pursuit of finding a diplomacy between Iran and the U.S. on the nuclear issue. That's where most of my focus is right now, to get a diplomatic resolution. And I met Erica at a Plowshares meeting. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Farshad. You bring a really important voice on this issue, and I'm so glad you're here. John, and then MJ.
Hello, everybody. I'm John Song, and I'm very happy to be on this panel. I'm a child of the 80s, so the whole nuclear discussion was very real in my childhood. Also, although I was raised here in the United States, I'm of Korean descent, and some of the occurrences that are happening in North Korea and whatnot has really brought me back to this conversation. And I sat in on a couple of Plowshare events, which has really kind of re-engaged me to this topic. I come from a background of entrepreneurship, but all of it around data. I consider myself a listener of community, of big data. Started out in business intelligence, went to web analytics, which means I got to watch and listen to what people did on websites. And then I moved to social media intelligence, which is all about listening to the big conversation on social media and trying to understand trends and be a little bit predictive on what's going on in the world. And most recently now I'm working with a company that deals with visual data. And so more and more the language of everyone on social or anywhere else is, on their phones is all visual. It's not text, it's not verbal. And understanding that language is very important. And so now, that's what I'm involved in. And I think that the ability to listen to the audiences, to communities today, and understand what's relevant and understand the language that's out there today is the way that you're going to get people interested in the story that you're trying to tell. And hopefully I can bring that perspective to you today. Thank you.
It's so great to have you, John, and I think it's interesting to note that at the same time that there's this enormous profusion of visual media in the world that, as you point out, we need to be paying attention to, we also have this uptick in audio. We have phenomenally popular podcasts going on. We have a resurgence of spoken word, slam poetry, youth speaks, and so there's a lot that we can unpack, I think, in all of that. So MJ, speaking of another culture, we'll get into gaming with you. So MJ, and then we'll turn it over to Emma.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'm coming from an entirely different culture from a lot of the folks on this panel, which is video games. My background is that I'm a game designer. I've been a game designer for about 25 years now. But kind of interestingly, in the last 3 years, I've switched over from making entertainment games. So I worked for Electronic Arts, for Sony PlayStation, for some companies like that, to help found a group called GlassLab. And GlassLab is making educational games. We're making games to go to school to teach kids a blend of different things, ranging from just simple math skills to more complex things like argumentation, and we're even teaching some things about collaboration and reasoning and some of the stuff we're working on now. So yeah, I've got a lot of background in games. I have very little background in nuclear security until about a couple of weeks ago. Had a pretty fascinating, actually, I think a couple of people on this panel were part of this. We had a little game jam at GlassLab where we came up with some game ideas about nuclear security that were kind of interesting, a little bit alarming, I think, in a lot of ways. But I also think that video games have a heritage, and it's interesting. So John was talking about being a kid of the '80s, as was I, and what that meant to grow up in the States, thinking about always what's going to happen. Is there some sort of apocalypse going to come? And a lot of the video games of that era that I grew up with reflected that. So like I have a whole paper that I've written on Space Invaders being basically a Cold War product, and yeah, get a lot of nods on that. That's good. So. I think that video games actually have a surprising amount of relevance, and I look forward to having this conversation about how we can maybe bring that into sharing what the issues of today are with younger people.
So I think, MJ, you're in great company in terms of people who don't feel at all that they're nuclear security experts, and I would certainly count myself among you. But luckily, we have one with us. So we have Emma Belcher from the MacArthur Foundation, our friend and colleague on this project. And Emma, I think you can help give a little more context for the conversation we're about to have.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, Erica, and welcome everybody. We're really excited to be holding this roundtable. So I'm Emma Belcher. I direct the International Peace and Security Program at the MacArthur Foundation. And as part of my nuclear security portfolio, we fund policy-relevant research to reduce nuclear risk. And one of the things I tend to find when I talk to people through my job about my work, but also when I talk to my family and friends, is just how surprised people are to hear that the threat from nuclear weapons is still quite large. Most people associate nuclear weapons with the Cold War and the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, but many are really surprised to hear that despite the reduction in weapons since the Cold War, there are roughly 16,000 nuclear weapons still remaining in the world, thousands of which are on a high state of alert and pointed at heavily densely populated cities. And a number of people actually find that quite outrageous and unacceptable and are really shocked to learn these facts. And I think when we think about the situation we're in today, we actually have more countries now than during the Cold War that possess nuclear weapons, and potentially some that would like to possibly acquire nuclear weapons. We also know, as some of our panelists have pointed out, that there are terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda in particular, that have expressed their desire to acquire nuclear weapons and would undoubtedly use them if they actually acquired them. So I think we're in a situation today where arguably we're actually at a greater risk of some kind of nuclear detonation at some point, because we've got more actors that possess these weapons or maybe have a desire to do so, which increases the likelihood that they might be used either intentionally or perhaps by accident, as Dante was talking about. So I think what the big challenge is here is how can we educate people about the reality of the nuclear threat, and how can we encourage them to take actions about decisions that are being made in their name about which they might not be aware and with which they might not agree. So that's the particular challenge here. And I think we think about millennials and how many of them were born after the end of the Cold War, and many of them aren't aware of the sort of experience that many people went through during the Cold War. And how can we really tap into them, and how can we use different media outlets to get through to them but not scare them? So that's one of the things that sort of struck me when Erica was talking about her experience growing up and being in New York and hearing planes and being scared. How can we get that message across but make people feel that there's something they can do rather than run away and perhaps bury their head in the sand? So I think what we're looking for here today is to sort of bring together a great group of people with varied experiences in media to help us think through what might we do as traditional funders to help get messages through, and then how might we get people to take action once they've received those messages. So we're really excited about that. We realised we weren't the ones who would be able to do this, so that's why we're thrilled to have everybody on the roundtable, and I think we should get right underway.
All right, we will do that. So we thought we would take a kind of a big frame to get us started here. And the question I would ask all of you is, given that there is this profusion, as we said earlier, profusion of new ways of telling stories, new ways of reaching people where they live, where they work, where they play, where they learn, there are lots of new channels. Really what it comes down to is that we have the need for lots of content, right? We have stories that we need to fill all of those channels with. And so I think the question is, what does this profusion of new channels tell us about what's going on culturally right now? And what kinds of stories really stick at this point, given that there is so much noise, really, so many different kinds of stories surrounding us all the time? So I wanted to start off, MJ, with you, given that you spend your time at this interesting nexus between technology and entertainment, to help us think aloud about what's going on culturally right now, and what can we learn from this?
Yeah, so I mean, games are often brought up, and I think rightly so, as this new medium for the late 20th or early 21st century, and it's different. And I think what kind of maybe has brought a lot of people to games, and also has brought games kind of out into the broader culture, is that we're kind of figuring out how it is that games are different. And I've been doing this long enough to have watched that evolve in large part. And the first thing that's interesting is a lot of times games don't tell stories at all. So you talk about different methods of storytelling, and that's great. But in fact, some of the most interesting games don't tell any story. And what they do instead is they're an embodiment of a system. And so when you have a game that you can interact with as a system, really the story changes every time you play it. So the classic example of this that a lot of video game players know is SimCity, where it's kind of a city planning game, but really it's whatever happens to happen to you when you start, and then keep going throughout the experience of the game. And I think that when you look at embracing games as a new type of media, asking like, well, what is the actual system that's involved here, and what are the components and characteristics of that system, is a really interesting way to start if you want to look at games as a different type of medium rather than just a storytelling medium. And can I have a game that allows a person to experience that system and the various outcomes that come from playing around with that system, rather than trying to tell a story at all?
So that's really interesting because, Erica, I know that one of the things that you spend a lot of time thinking about is, in fact, systems. And in the work that you do with Free Range Studios, and it sounds like in your background generally, this is important to you. So I'm sort of curious to hear, maybe building on some of what Michael just said, what we can learn from the success of certain things, like, let's say, the story of Stuff, which is obviously a compelling story, but it's a story about a systemic problem, or the Girl Effect, some of these other media. So I wonder if you could comment on all this.
Sure, and yeah, I really appreciate what MJ just shared, and being able to piggyback off of that, because to me, I really feel like it's a both and it's true. I'm passionate about systems thinking. It's a personal passion, and it's also obviously a professional and kind of messaging passion of mine, because in a way, just to put it simply, that for me is one of the ways, it's a learning style for me that is personally really effective. Like when I'm able to see the gestalt of something and be able to see how a lot of pieces kind of factor together, that for me is very helpful. But what I would also say as a kind of, an addition and a kind of a complementarity to that is that, I think we're seeing just more and more the proof that from a story-based perspective, it's still really about compelling emotion. It's like if you can make someone laugh really hard, if you can make someone feel like you're speaking to them in a way that really touches their heart in a profound way. I mean, there's these kind of simple human elements to how we connect with each other and how we feel motivated. And I think, whenever someone can see themselves as a potential hero or as a collaborative hero in a story, in a way that moves them based on really core values, of who they are and what they believe in, it's a really powerful thing. I think that what to me is really interesting and kind of critical around the systems perspective is that if you don't have that as the kind of substrate of your approach and your knowledge base, figuring out what those kind of acupuncture points are can be less effective. So I really think that sort of systems approach and thinking about it, from the angle that MJ was pointing out, and then bringing in when you're trying to put that sort of targeted content out in story-based ways, throughout a variety of media channels, but making sure that content is at that point really heart-centered and really, really salient for people's core values.
Farshad, I think, I'm guessing there are several different ways you could jump in on this. And, as a person who is deeply familiar with a couple of cultures, as an Iranian American, but also as a political scientist and somebody who's working in Hollywood right now, I think there are a lot of different directions you could take us. Sort of curious to know what you're thinking as you listen to MJ and Erica about what's going on culturally.
Well, it's incredible what's going on, especially with new media. I was in Iran during the 2009 protest, and our Twitter and Facebook were key in mobilizing that country, especially a country that 70% is under 30, and they're vying for this nuclear deal. So they're very interested in the nuclear talk right now. So they're a great test populace that we could test on new media, and so that, and everything we do here, the world really follows and grasps, especially in Iran right now with the nuclear issue. With the MJ's concept of the video games, we're just working right now on a game called 1979 Revolution, where the individual is put in either as an Iranian revolutionary or as an American Marine, and they get to experience the 79 revolution from many perspectives. So that really, I think, and he's the creator, he was one of the creators of Grand Theft Auto, a director of Grand Theft Auto. And so, a lot of friends always tell me, well, a lot of times I play these Middle Eastern terrorist roles or militant roles. And friends say, well, aren't you exasperating the stereotypes? But I feel like, if we get in there and get the emotional and the personal going, then, they could in Iran, they could call me a traitor or a terrorist here. But at least we open up that cultural discussion and get across some form of cross movement between them. Some video games would be key here to give us options, especially with the nuclear issue. There are alternatives such as nonviolent movements or nonviolent alternatives that could be used in a video game as an option for the user as they're going through a game. So I think new media is extremely key in bridging these cultures. Now, you could use them as a militant role or not, but it brings everyone together in this discussion, at least. And so it's happening in Iran, and you can have a very big populace there interested right now in some sort of new media that engages the nuclear issue.
MJ, I know you've got a thought based on something that Farshad just said, so jump on in.
Yeah, Farshad, I love that idea of that game that you're talking about, especially the part you said about the fact that the player can play either side of this particular conflict. And one of the things that's really, really powerful in games is the fact that we put the players in a role. You're taking a role and you're embodying that role. And when you set it up so you can be on either side of a situation in that role, that's incredibly powerful, and it's really a great idea. I just want to compliment you guys on that idea. I love it.
That's great. That's great. You heard it here first. So with that, I want to switch gears just a little bit, although in a minute I'm going to come back to you, Erica, and talk about some more concrete examples that I think you can share with us. But before we go to that, I want to hear both from Dante and John. And Dante, I think I'm going to take this a slightly different direction. You alluded in your introduction to an experience you had that brought you to this issue of nuclear security. And so first of all, I think it's interesting for us to start with that story of your own. What was going on for you? What did you see? And what happened as a result of you seeing the film that you did? So just tell us that story a little bit.
Well, when I saw the film, I think it was around 2008 or 2009, which was at the same time paralleled with the way Twitter was just becoming a new outreach, a new way for people to connect, not only in your state or in your country, but also around the world as it evolved into what it is today. And I was able to watch that documentary, and it really disturbed me because I'm a person who loves history, and I went to school at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, which is literally right that just how close we were to a detonation here in the country or somewhere by accident, which could cause mass destruction and mass devastation. So that initiated my entrance into the whole national security issue as far as nuclear weapons. Now, once Twitter started to evolve, I was able to make some connections, and luckily I was able to connect with someone who I had seen on the video named Joe Cerancione, who is, as you guys know, the president of Plowshares Fund. And so I was able to develop a relationship with him And we really became close, and I was able to really see, some of the behind-the-scenes work that Plowshares is doing, and not only Plowshares, but a number of other organizations that are really involved in this. But that alone let me know, as someone who had no idea about nuclear weapons. At the time, I was playing in the NFL, so that just brought to my attention how important this was, how important this issue was, and you weren't hearing about it. That's the thing that scared me most, outside of the fact that we could have a detonation, in this country or somewhere, just in general. The thing that bothered me the most and that really disturbed me the most was that I was hearing about this outside of this documentary or outside of hearing it from Joe. But now I think people are starting to come around more, obviously, now with the Iran deal that we're trying to work out now, and I think it's become more to the forefront. So people are starting to pay more attention to it. And my personal experience through that documentary, but also attempting to reach people on social media and friends of mine in person and other, just try to reach out to the guys and let them know that this is an important issue that, if they feel strongly about it, they should get behind it.
So just to stick with you for a second, Dante, so now that you are as immersed in this world as you are through the Huffington Post, I'm sort of curious to know what you think does stick for people. It doesn't necessarily have to be on this issue anymore, but from where you sit, and you're obviously very involved in social media, but you also have this position at Huffington Post. What would you say is what sticks for people, right? So when you talk to friends or others, what are they talking about? What media are they talking about?
Well, I think unfortunately in all of media today, I think the important things is that you look at the last and only time nuclear weapons were detonated in 1945. So that alone was so long ago that brings it or that leaves it in the back of people's minds. But the threat today is more dangerous. In the last few decades since the Cold War has been ended. So I think it's an important issue that people need to really look at from a standpoint of how the media is projecting this issue. There's a lot of talks now with the Iran deal and the P5+1, and just looking at that, we all know that that is nuclear weapons, regardless of who has them. Is something dangerous and something that which we should really try to get rid of. But at the core of this issue, and as far as reaching people, I think the unfortunate thing is that, that a nuclear weapon was detonated was so long ago that it is in the back of people's minds. That's the unfortunate part. But the fortunate part is that you can start to see people are starting to pay more attention now, and it is a lot has to do with the negotiations in Geneva right now.
So, John, you bring a pretty unique perspective, I think, in this panel, in the sense that you can comment on this question of what sticks for people and why. What can we learn about what's working in the media? Right, so you are an entrepreneur, you've worked on web analytics, you've done a lot of work on social media intelligence, and now you're focused on visual imagery. So help us understand what sticks for the general public right now. What should we be paying attention to?
Yeah, if I knew the real answer to that, maybe I wouldn't have to start another company. But there are certain trends definitely that are out there. And for me, what's really important, I think there are, by the conversation that's already been had, there are people that really already know, some things that would work, some things that don't work. I'd love the game idea as well. I think that would be very compelling and it would resonate well. My perspective is a little different, and then I'll answer your question. The great thing about social media now is that a lot of people have voice, and there's a voice of the crowd. But also there's so much data that you don't have to guess on what works and what doesn't work. And you can see trends. And if you analyze the data correctly, you can actually be predictive and understand, what may happen next. And even more important, I think, in this discussion, is that you can really understand what's compelling. Because Erica said compelling in an emotional way, what's really relevant in a conversation. You know, if you're at a social club or whatever, you have to kind of speak that same language for you to be relevant for people to listen to you. In the case of our topic today, it's hard to be relevant to the millennials and the younger people who are using the languages of the past, like the 80s, where we talked about that I'm from. That doesn't work. And so what the social media, what the web data, what visual shows us is how people talk about certain things, difficult things, of different topics. And there's enough tools out there, and this technology is advancing so quickly that you can try different methods of communications or different ways of storytelling and learn very quickly from the crowd whether it resonates or it doesn't. And so the thing that I guess I like to get out there more than saying what sticks and what doesn't stick is there are technology and there are methods and means by which you can make the conversation much more relevant than what I think we've been able to do up to this point, especially to the young people and across different cultures. And whether it's visual, whether it's textual, whether it's voice, all of those things can be tested in the market very quickly because of technology. And that way we can find out what is going to be compelling, what is going to be relevant. We can do it very quickly, and we can change our story, or we can change the context so that we can be more relevant, so that people are more aware of what's going on about our topic around nuclear risk today. I do know that statistics say that if you can get some influencers to talk about it, or if you can get people to talk about a certain topic, it's much more likely that the friends or the contacts or the acquaintances of those people are going to be interested in that topic, are going to open up those links and become involved in that conversation. And so without going into what sticks, what doesn't stick, I haven't run an insights campaign to figure that out quite yet. But I do know that the way to do it is get to the influencers, get to the people, make them talk about it, lead the conversation, but let them talk about it, and basically let the social media dictate that or grow that conversation in a very organic way, and that's the way that we can influence the conversation.
So we're going to talk more in just a few minutes, John, about metrics, I think you've brought up an important point about reaching influencers, and obviously we've asked all of you to be in this conversation because you're influencers in some way or another. And so I want to ask you all what you've seen personally or professionally, or maybe it's something that your millennial children have seen that has really made a difference in the way they view the world. Right? So Erica, I know I'm going to ask you to comment on that, both from your own perspective as a producer of media and as somebody who's paying attention to the kind of current mythology that we all inhabit. So what has really moved you, made a difference in the way you see the world, and why do we think it's working?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like I approach that from a bunch of different angles for myself. I am definitely a media consumer. The way that I tend to consume media, actually, though, is through, through television and real story-based kind of content. So, I'm pretty fascinated from a digital marketing and digital media space, like how much quality that there is out there in terms of storytelling capacity, and that's not it's a fraction of what the larger kind of swath of media, but I do think that there are really good shows and content that are asking some good questions and kind of telling stories in a compelling way. And it's funny. I was thinking I watched that show Manhattan for a little bit. I watched pretty much all the episodes that were available currently on Hulu, and I was kind of intrigued. I find the sort of the mythology around Oppenheimer and the kind of philosophical kind of existential crisis that he's quoted as having had in his quoting of the Bhagavad Gita, upon the launching of the bomb, as a very interesting, deep human question. I feel like, without getting too existential, I actually think that there's a lot going on right now in the millennial space, and I don't pretend to like speak for millennials. I'm not a millennial myself. I'm on the cusp, but I don't try to pretend like I know all the answers to the $1 million millennial question. But I do feel like there's a sensitivity out there to values that are really actually pretty empowered values. I mean, I think that right now, culturally, we are attuned, and I was just listening to that show on the media this past weekend, and they did this amazing kind of segment about nihilism, and this, the sort of pop culturalization of nihilism, which is not a new thing necessarily, but that's very present. You have these amazingly written characters like the True Detective Matthew McConaughey character. I mean, you have these characters that are showing up in the media that are asking these like kind of profound, crazy questions, and and it shows the shadow side of what I think are actually real values around love and empowerment. And I think that the kind of media that I see sticking and really like motivating people are pieces of content that have a real empowerment aspect like that to them. Something where you see, you really see this deep connection, or you feel like you are really resonating with humanity and your particular group at the same time. And I think that it's like I guess I feel like the millennial and the younger generations, and when we were working on the Global Zero project specifically, a lot of what we were thinking about and focusing on and hearing from those audiences, and even in the video content that we did and the sort of offline strategies, on the ground strategies, as well as the online strategies to engage that millennial audience, like they were really resonating with the content as passionate spokespeople for values that were very much around love and justice and kind of a common humanity. And there was an ability to articulate those values in a way that they were living them and embodying them that didn't feel as readily available or as much a part of the kind of common cultural dialogue as, say, for example, when I was that age, or earlier generations.
So it's interesting, many of us have a more cynical view of what's going on around media and what sticks, and it's hard not to when everybody in the world in 24 hours is talking about a dress suddenly.
Right.
So I'm sort of curious how that squares, Erica, with what you're describing, and then MJ, I'm going to turn over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I jumped right on that dress bandwagon. I thought that was fascinating, and I thought it was fascinating. Here we are continuing the buzz, but I thought it was fascinating because my husband he showed me the dress. He's like, "What do you see?" And I was like, "It's blue and black. Of course it's blue and black," and he was like, "What?" And he's like, "Other people are saying it's," and I was like, I was blown away. And then, so of course I got completely intrigued, and I was also very intrigued. I'm sure everybody on this panel has sort of witnessed or seen how there's been a lot of really clever leveraging of that whole like meme, if you will, since that all happened. I mean, a lot of socially engaged organizations and campaigns leveraged that whole buzz in a way that I thought was really super effective. But my own personal thought on it too is that I feel like it's a really good example because it's very rare, I think, for something that seems so simply objective, i.e. like colors, that break down into two groups. And it's so rare that we get a chance to have something that's seemingly so objective, but that has like brought us into these two different like polarities for us to engage in the most basic way, which is that desire for connection. So it's like that whole thing just blew up because everybody's like, how can I connect to you? How can I connect to you? I don't see the same thing you see. And other people, I don't see the same thing you see. And it was sort of like the underpinning of what it means to be human in this weird way, which is we're always trying to figure out, like, how the heck does this person see this that way and I see it as this way? And I thought it was this very great example that was just sort of handed to everybody on a silver platter or gold platter or platinum, depending on what you see. That's just like okay, have at it. There's some fundamental differences and similarities, and how do we connect? How do we find connection? So that's my dress buzz building there.
Or a blue platter, I suppose.
Right, exactly.
And that, by the way, that went surprisingly. I happen to have a millennial kid, so that thing went very viral amongst millennials too.
Yeah.
I actually have a completely different example. From a couple of years ago, the British Rail Authority wanted to produce, and you're already nodding at it, Erica, maybe you've seen this, but something to get young people to stop trying to beat the train at rail crossings, to step back from the platform of the subway and things like that. And rather than doing the typical type of PR campaign that you would do for that kind of public service, they created an animated film and a cell phone game called Dumb Ways to Die. That's very funny, and actually the game is really, really well built as well. And what was interesting to me, and it went very viral amongst kids, both those things did. And what was fascinating was a couple things. One was that kids would discover it either through the YouTube video or through the mobile app, and it was hard to tell which was more powerful. But the two definitely worked with each other in a way that was very complementary, and it's actually probably the best example I've ever seen of a game and a linear thing working in a complementary fashion like that. And the second thing was just the content of it, which is maybe speaks a little bit to what the millennials want, which is just tell me the truth, tell me what's actually going to happen, and don't try to make cute little drawings that say, well, this might happen if you're not careful enough. The thing was a little gruesome, and that really kind of resonated and was a big part of why it was so viral. So that whole tell the truth thing, I think, is part of it as well.
Yeah, I think these examples are really terrific, and also something that we're really particularly interested in to help us figure out, okay, what might work and what might we try and all the rest. And I think also, just to get back on the blue and black or whatever color dress, I think, Erica did mention the organizations that tried to leverage that, and the Salvation Army comes to mind, and the way that they use that to really publicize the issue of domestic violence. And it sort of brings to mind a question for me. It'll be interesting to see what action people actually did take in response to seeing that. So I thought it was particularly clever, but then how do we make sure that these things aren't just a flash in the pan? Are there ways for people to engage so that whatever sort of story or issue of the day people can hook onto, how does that then translate into action? So I think really it's a question on the dress, for example, that we can't answer right now because maybe we're not sure, but this is something that I think would be interesting for us to think about as we move forward.
So that's great, Emma. And by the way, MJ, thanks for mentioning Dumb Ways to Die, which if we can post it for our live audience, we should do that. And certainly my 8 and 10-year-olds have been playing Dumb Ways to Die pretty much incessantly. So I can almost hum it for you in the session, but I will spare you that. But I think we have another really good example among us that we actually know a lot about in terms of the reasons for its success or exactly what happened. And Erica, I'm going to come back to you to tell the story of stuff. So what do we know about it? What can we learn from it?
Yeah, Story of Stuff was a amazing project to work on. I felt really honored to have a chance to work on that project, and I learned a tremendous amount. And even though it's a few years old now, there's still a lot of great takeaways that we got from the project, and that, of course, Annie Leonard, whose life changed radically as a result of the project, would certainly speak to. But I think Story of Stuff at a sort of a 50,000-foot view, like some of the key things I'd share about that are, certainly it does have something to do with zeitgeist, meaning like what is the kind of the hum that, the underlying hum that's going on amongst people that you can help them to kind of articulate something in a way that taps into that unsatisfied, the itch that needs to be scratched kind of thing. And something And we found that Story of Stuff really did that. And Annie's initial definition of success for that project was 50,000 views, which of course happened like in the first 24 hours. And the project though was a really great example of content plus really smart strategy and outreach and thinking about what it's like to talk to a lot of different audiences simultaneously. And if you're going to try to do that, how do you create content that speaks specifically to those different audience needs? And, Story of Stuff was a project that was very collaborative. There was a lot of input. There were a lot of organizations that had a chance to kind of review or give feedback or help participate in the message building. And those groups and coalitions and organizations were all leveraged in the outreach as well. And so part of what made the project a success was being able to break a very, very complex topic down into something that, was layperson language and was, of course, bringing in some humor, because that's the other thing that I'll say is that, humor can obviously be a really useful tool. And The Dumb Ways to Die is a great example of that as well. Simplicity and humor are, you kind of can't go wrong in a lot of cases. Of course, depending on the nature of the project, but those generally can be really good tools. And so, yeah, Story of Stuff is an example where, speaking to all those different audiences' needs, having them be able to identify themselves in the piece in a way that allowed them to take some kind of nugget or piece of that project and leverage it for the specific needs that they had, was both part of the success of the content itself, but, of course, the outreach and distribution strategy, too. And that's something that we find, time and again. I mean, we just launched a campaign about a week and a half ago that's gotten 2 million views already, and a big part of that is because of the leveraging of groups and different voices at the table, as part of the outreach strategy.
Can you just briefly describe what the Story of Stuff is for folks who may not?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so the Story of Stuff it's a 20-minute animation live action combo video that explains the unsustainable throughput of materials in a linear materials economy. So extraction through disposal of materials as we engage in our kind of consumer society as it is, without making changes and trying to incorporate some real closed loop environmental systems and smart ways of using our resources. And and then broadly speaking, given that that's the kind of nitty gritty of the piece, but of course there's a larger commentary on what we are valuing as a culture and as a society, and the fact that as Annie Leonard likes to say, we need to start building our citizen muscle rather than our consumer muscle, and kind of shift our priorities back to our engagement with our culture and society as citizens and not just as consumers. So that's the gist of it.
So that's great. In a previous episode, we talked a little bit about how those folks who talk about solutions to wicked problems stress the importance of being able to see the whole problem space, to be able to get a top view of the whole problematic so you can see where the opportunities for engagement lie. And it strikes me that that's really what the Story of Stuff did in a very engaging, very human, sometimes humorous, and very accessible way. It laid out the whole problematic in a way that had never been done before.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that's what I was appreciating early at the beginning of the session in MJ's comment about, kind of a systems perspective, is I do find that, and I think generally, from a messaging perspective, I think people appreciate being able to see some version of the whole picture, even if it's a very simple, sort of streamlined representation of it, because it helps them identify, where and how they want to plug into that, and whether that's something that you get in a single snapshot in a way like you do with Story of Stuff, or whether that's something that you're able to piece together when you see all of the different sort of tendrils of a campaign and the variety of collateral that's related to the messaging on that. I think it's useful. I think that's an important part of the strategy for any kind of communications approach, obviously.
MJ, I wonder if you could talk about, from a gaming perspective, what are those games that we ought to be paying attention to? Because maybe they have something to teach us right now about what draws people and keeps them in the game environment. You know, maybe there's a way to extrapolate from some of that learning.
Yeah, well, I suppose John probably knows a lot about this stuff these days too. A lot of, I mean, when we talk about engagement and sort of re-engagement and stickiness in games, a lot of that is, like, for example, we used to just make a game and sell it, and then that was the end of it. And now we make a game, and then it's constantly being updated, maybe as much as once a week. And that's almost kind of become an expectation for young people playing games, that the game is not going to be something that's static, that it's going to have some kind of constant change in it. The other thing would be connectivity between people, that somehow or another this game that I'm playing has an engagement with another person, and that's taken a lot more forms than it used to, which is kind of neat and exciting. A lot of those forms now are asynchronous. I take a turn, you take a turn. We might be hours and time zones apart, but we can still play with each other that way. So these are a couple of the sort of forms that are underlying a lot of the stickiness in games these days.
It's interesting that there's a strand developing through many of your comments here about human connection, right? And the idea of needing to be connected, whether you're in a game environment or whether you're using some crazy thing that you saw online last night about a dress, but that we're really getting to some very fundamental stuff about human connectivity, which we will come back to in just a second. But I know, Farshad, you want to jump in here, and then we're gonna go deeper on this question of how to know whether we're having the kind of impact we want with new media. So Farshad, let's hear from you first.
Yes, as far as examples, I'm going to go back to the previous question. For me, the ice bucket challenge was very interesting. It really caught on. And I think with the nuclear issue with Iran right now, something that incorporates the color concept that we had talked about, and then a choice of diplomacy versus war, and infiltrate that through the Iranian populace, and then bring maybe, we're talking with Global Zero right now, doing a celebrity kind of talk about Iran, like they had done before with Michael Douglas and Matt Damon a few years back. So something like that, I think, that links the ice bucket challenge concept to the Iran talks with celebrities. I would think that'd be a great thing right now to get people really tuned into the nuclear issue. That could be a doorway into what we're talking about here.
So, you know, that brings up an important point here too, Farshad, which is just to be challenging in a way for a moment. Excuse me. One of the big challenges that we face is how to get outside an echo chamber of people who are already paying attention to this issue, which is not to say that the notion that you just described would be a problem there. But one thing we've seen with other media that have been produced about nuclear disarmament or non-proliferation is that we might get a lot of hits on that media, but the people, if we really do the analytics, what we find out is that it's people who are already engaged. We're not reaching beyond the borders of that community. So I'm going to come to you in just a second, John, to talk a little bit about how we bust out or how we know whether we're actually reaching a broader audience. We were going to get to metrics, but first let me just say that participant media has done an important job of looking at the social impact of entertainment through the participant index that they've developed. And one of the things that may seem obvious even in terms of this conversation is that the greater the emotional engagement with a story, the more likely viewers are to take action, to respond with action. And in fact, their index findings show that it's the people who walk away from a film or something they've seen on the web saying, this changed my life, that are the people who are most likely to take action or to reach out and try and have some kind of influence in their community about that issue. But it doesn't happen very much of the time. Yeah? So we're really interested in this question, not just of how to produce good media, but how to know we're actually reaching a wider audience. So John, help us know what we ought to be paying attention to. Let's assume we're kind of newbies on this. You know, what should we be paying attention to?
Well, you know, technology allows us to look at a lot of data in a way that we weren't able to before. And, you know, big data is a big issue. So it's easy to measure a lot of different things. And I agree with you that the echo chamber is a real issue on any specialized target topic. I think what we'll, again, as I mentioned before, I think that the way to get out of that is to really reach out to influencers. And if you look at the bucket challenge and whatnot, it was really the influencers that took it out of that echo chamber. And so you have to be able to reach them. Now, how do you know which influencers you need to really reach to get to that tipping point on a topic? That's what you got to look for. And again, big data allows you to look at that. It's not always who you think it is. It's not the blogger. You know, it's not those people that will do the crossover. It's sometimes the most unsuspecting person. Or in a lot of cases, it's some kind of influencer by celebrity status, especially with the millennials and whatnot, that makes the topic much more relevant. And those are elements that you can actually find. Those are gold nuggets you can actually find. If you look at big data, if you look at social media data, you can kind of decipher who's going to be those types of influencers. And you can measure that, and you can actively campaign to those influencers, you know, and help them write the story. Because I mean, what influencers are the people that take you over that tipping point, are the people that make your story, the way that you put it, relevant to the people that you're trying to reach, which aren't in the echo chamber. And finding those people are just as important, and understanding how they message and the relevance that they need is as important, you know, as any other thing that you can do. And the metrics and big data, that if you use it appropriately, you can find those people, and I think that's really a critical first step.
So, Farshad, I want to come back to you because you were beginning to talk to us a little bit about influencers and working with influencers in this space around nuclear security. So I'm curious. I want to have you expand on your ideas a little bit here, and maybe come back to Emma's comment at the very beginning of this episode that we want to look for ways to reach people, reach influencers, so that we can reach more people, but without necessarily resorting to scare tactics.
Well, I think we have a chance right now where diplomacy can work, and just to piggyback on that success and incorporate some celebrities or some specialists and some people from Iran. And I can understand that this needs to become something where people get engaged in afterward, not just click on it. But right now you have a massive population inside Iran, very young, that's ready to kind of get engaged in any type of social media, something like the Ice Bucket Challenge, like I mentioned. So, you know, bringing celebrities from across the world and promoting this diplomatic success, I think, would be a start. Now, again, to follow through and get really people engaged, that's something I'm trying to educate myself by talking to you guys.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Farshad. Something you said in addition to just now, but also much earlier on when you started off, something that struck me was your comment about how many Iranians are sort of really interested in what's going on. And it sort of makes me think about people that I've spoken to who've been involved with sort of discussions with Iranians, that so many of them really do want improved relations with the United States. And that's something that we don't see a lot here in the media. And so, you know, the idea of how can we do better at sort of connecting the populations so that they can really be able to learn about the other, and so there's not such a demonization. And I think, you know, I come back to my opening remarks where I think a lot of decisions are being made and negotiations are underway without actually the sort of necessarily the knowledge of the people whose government officials are acting on their behalf. So, you know, it just makes me sort of really interested in exploring this idea, I think, particularly in the gaming way, and how you can sort of have both sides play each other's side and all of that kind of thing. I really think there's something there. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Sorry for chiming in again, but to your point, I think at this point, the only entity that can ensure Iran's government does not go nuclear, is not sanctions, is not a war, is the Iranian people. In the last several years, from 2009 and then up to 2013, they've reformed their government. They've worked hard to reform their government. And a lot of them are pro this deal so they can economically open up to the world, strengthen themselves, and they alone can really ensure Iran doesn't go nuclear or any other country. So getting movements within these countries and connecting them to our people here, I think that's key. And to me, that would be a major step. Now, whether with gaming or social media or celebrities or whatnot, I think that entity has to be empowered, and it's not in the equation right now. And it can only, I mean, the Iranian people are the only people who can keep the regime from going nuclear. That's, I mean, to me, that's a very cold fact. So, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and kind of piggyback off what Farshad was saying. I think it is important to understand that, you know, with there is an issue between whether if it's war or diplomacy. Now, sometimes or a lot of the times, as you've seen, it's you'll hear a lot of from the opposition of getting this deal done. You'll hear a lot of we need to preemptively strike Iran, which basically means we need to go to war in Iran before we go to war with Iran while they possess nuclear weapons. So that's not that's the scare tactics that need to be fought against. It's more so of also, like Farshad said, it is the most this regime that they have now in Iran is the best opportunity for us to get a nuclear deal done within the last 20, 30 years. And I think it's important that we take advantage of this crucial moment in time.
So let's keep going with this. And I'm curious now to come back, MJ. You started a strand here, I think, some time back that we're still building on. And I want to come back to this question of how you look at the intersection between gaming and the kind of social activism that Farshad and Dante have been talking about in the last few minutes. Yeah,
I mean, my bias is always to see these things through games, you know, and what are the things that games can do and that we can think about with games. The stuff that Farshad is saying is really fascinating to me. I mean, just building a game that has those two perspectives that we talked about earlier is such a brilliant idea, and I think is the kind of thing that you can have on both sides of that conflict to give more empathy. Games can be really, really good for expanding empathy across some divide or another. I also think it would be fascinating to look at just, like, let's say for an American audience, speaking directly to what Dante was just talking about, can you create a game that makes me live as a modern Iranian? So that instead of hearing whatever polemic that I'm hearing through the media, I'm actually looking at it as an experience. And, you know, I might find that experience is pretty similar to my own, you know, except for these three issues or whatever that comes up in that simulation could be, like, really, really powerful. And I think that we're seeing, you know, as the technology gets cheaper, as we get more and more people that are able to make games, we have, I don't even know how many universities now teaching game making as part of a curriculum, that more and more of these type of activist games can be made and distributed, and a lot of them are really exciting. You know, one of my favorites, another thing you can link maybe, is a game called Sweatshop. It's called, I think, sweatshopgame.com or something like that, that forces the player to have the experience of running a sweatshop in some unnamed country. And it's very uncomfortable. And it makes you think twice about, I mean, it makes me go back to Story of Stuff in a big hurry when you play that game. So, you know, these kind of games can be very affecting emotionally in terms of having put the player in the role of experiencing something that's positive or negative or maybe just different than what your daily life is.
So, MJ, I think it's important for you to talk a little bit also about the kind of games that you're developing right now in the educational context, because one of the things that we know games can be good for is anticipating what somebody needs to learn next and then helping to measure the knowledge that somebody has gained about a particular topic. And I just wonder if there's anything there in terms of metrics and analytics that you would say we should be paying attention to.
Yeah, well, we're making games for learning, and we're making games for school learning mostly, which is a very specific kind of thing. But we do look at, you know, in your performance in the game, that's an indicator of whether or not you understand the concept. And, you know, it is certainly interesting to think about, could we also take that toward, you know, how much have you built your empathy towards some other situation? Or have you explored all the different possibilities for how to deal with all the currently out there fissionable material or not? And we could certainly look at it that way. I would also look at something else, which is there's a developer called Telltale Games that makes these story-based games. The best known one was the one based on the Walking Dead. And you get to certain points in the game where you have to make decisions. You have to make moral choices that are often very disturbing in terms of who you're going to leave behind, that kind of choice. And then when you get to the end of the chapter, it shows what choices you made and how that compares with the rest of the world's population. And of course, what you see is, by and large, you make the same choices as the rest of the world, even though you felt at the time that it was this terribly difficult choice that you had to make. So if you want to sort of measure, not so much measure empathy, but compare empathy, maybe across different parts of the world or different players in different situations, different ages, that kind of sort of global aggregation can be really interesting as well.
Erica, you had some thoughts behind the scenes here. I happen to know that you had some thoughts about virtual reality that build on what we're talking about right here. Can you jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that, we're a little ways out from this, but I'm kind of fascinated by where some aspects of media storytelling are going in terms of being able to kind of immerse people from a virtual reality perspective into an experience. And, I know that at Sundance's the New Frontier program, they explored aspects of virtual reality and storytelling, and I think they were talking about that experience that they did with the movie The Wild, where you'll be able to have an experience of actually being in the narrative, like in a 3D perspective. So things that obviously building off that, the point around empathy, I think one of the there's blessings and curses to the fact that we have such an abundance of media and access to information, which is that, of course, there's like greater and greater desensitization that's happening. And so, and I think oddly enough, at the same time that there's desensitizing, there's also, people feeling overwhelmed and unwilling to kind of expose themselves to the most grim kinds of realities that we might be facing. And so I feel like there's an ambitious challenge, but could be very exciting around how do you expose people to something in a really experiential way that gives them a taste of something empathically, but then follows it up with very clear calls to action. And that's the second piece of what I wanted to say, in terms of this thread, is like what is the action that people can take? Like what is the thing that we are going to move people to do, like upon digesting whatever it is we're talking about? And so, and I think that the first step that's vital to that is I think people are, I really think that the kind of 70-30 split is really important in terms of like keep the problem statement as short and powerful as you can, but then really build people back up with some aspect of feeling encouraged or empowered or hopeful, because of course we're saturated with a lot of potentially hopelessness right now. And I think that one of the key issues of this particular issue, is how do you make the general public feel like they can affect change on this? If it has to do with policy, I mean, there's so much that's behind this as a political topic. Like, what are those entry points for people where they're like, yes, I'm going to be able to see that my voice explicitly made a difference there.
So I'd like to come back, Erica, to the story of Steph, because I think it's both a good, specific, maybe well known for most people listening to this conversation, and an analogous example, which I think is important here, and ask, so how did you measure success? Did you use, I'm assuming you use both qualitative and quantitative metrics.
Yeah.
How did you know that you had achieved your goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the goals, as I stated, like the initial defined goals of success for that project were honestly very modest. I mean, and have been surpassed like 100-fold at this point. I mean, the question around, you know, the sort of ROI question, you know, which is where, you know, if you approach like the sort of the creation of media campaigns from a real cut and dry perspective around, you know, the metrics are important, but there's so many aspects. You know, it's views, it's like what kinds of conversations did it generate? Did it generate controversy? You know, it's like when Glenn Beck picks up the story of Steph and starts bashing Annie Leonard and calling her, you know, Marx with a ponytail, you know, that those are elements of success because it's becoming part of a broader conversation and dialogue, you know, and so there are a lot of aspects, I think, to the definition of that. I think what makes it tricky, I think what's interesting, though, and a slight differentiator between this issue and the story of Steph is I think that, I mean, you could make them analogous in that you could say that, okay, so Story of Steph is in some ways taking on capitalism as we know it. And you could say, in a really broad stroke way, that, you know, the existence of nuclear weapons is an investment in, you know, a violence-based way of problem solving. I mean, there's like big statements you could make about these things. I think what's different is that Story of Steph didn't necessarily have any specific policy outcomes. You know, it was trying to start a conversation and get movement on a lot of different aspects, whereas I think that in many ways this issue, there is a clear definition of sex. If we could get rid of nuclear weapons, and the 16,000 that was mentioned, you know, when Emma sort of set up the context for this as a problem, and this problem statement, you know, if those did not exist, then that would be success. You know, there is in some ways like a more black and white definition, or there's a more concrete definition in some ways of what we might call a success with this topic. So, and that's where I think it gets tricky with the policy questions and, you know, and how do we actually get people engaged around that explicitly.
Okay, so I'm going to use this moment to shift gears, and I'm going to ask you all to go with me on a kind of imaginative trip here and say, let's assume that the sky's the limit, which, by the way, is not true, but let's assume that resources are not an issue at all, and I've asked all of you to be my advisory group about media at N Square. And I've told you, let's say we have a couple years and we have a couple $1 million, but really, other than that, there are no constraints. What would you tell us to do? And Dante, I'm kind of curious what you would do to reach more people like Dante Stallworth. What would you tell us to do?
You know, I think it's interesting also when you look at the dynamics of professional sports. I think there is slight issue with players wanting to speak out about issues that are that are dear to them, but they don't want to receive the backlash. They don't want to speak out on things that are too controversial. But one thing that I always personally tried to do was to get involved in things that I was passionate about, things that I really wanted to see a change in. And I've done some of that work, but I think that it's also important to also raise awareness. So that's one thing I tried to do through Twitter. And I also have done it in the locker rooms by, as I mentioned before, dropping DVDs off in guys' lockers. And they know that if it's something that I drop off, then, you know, it's something that they probably should watch. Whether it latches on to them, I try not to bug them much. But piggybacking off of something that Erica said earlier, I wanted to mention before I forget, when she mentioned about Global Zero and the work that they're doing with the Millennials and the turnout that they had, and she mentioned how a lot of it was really revolved around like justice and love. Well, you look at what Vietnam brought about it in so many respects. It brought about the hippies. The hippies were all about what? Peace and love, right? So then they were the young generation of that time, and everyone thought the world was gonna end when the hippies and those young people took over. But I think today you look at it, it's sort of that same thing. I mean, the younger people are more concerned. And this is probably always accurate throughout recent histories. Younger people always concerned about the future, right? Because it's their future that they have. They'll be here a lot longer than us. So when you start talking about justice and civil rights and LGBT rights, it's a lot of the young people that are really the ones that are being the catalyst for these movements. So it's also something that they can latch onto as a nuclear weapons issue, because obviously no one wants to see a nuclear war between any countries or any kind of accidental detonation, because that in itself is something that could be very devastating. And you try to get young people to understand that, hey, this is, not only it's not only a world issue, and it's not alone an American and Iran and Israel issue. It's not an India and Pakistan issue, or it's not a North Korea, South Korea issue. This is an issue that is a world issue. It's a global issue. So you get young people to reach out to other young people all across the globe. As Farshad said earlier, you get some people over in Iran, a lot of young people in Iran and Tehran, a lot of young people around the world that want to communicate with people that are in other countries. So I think if we can get around that dynamic of it, I think that's something that young people could really latch onto, because at the end of the day, it is their future. This is, going to be their world, and the next.
Hey, Dante, thanks for reminding us that when we think about influencers, we can't forget young people, and think about the phenomenal influence that someone like Malala is having on the international dialogue at the moment. So thanks for that. That's a really important insight. MJ, so now you too get to give us your opinion. What would you do?
Sure. I think you should make some kind of fantastic game. So there's a great game that you can actually get on Steam called DEF CON, and what it is a reenactment, you play it, of global thermonuclear war 80s style. And it's a great game, and I would say that it's good, except for the fact that this is stuff we are all already aware of in terms of what that scenario looks like. I think what there's a real lack of awareness, even for myself, but especially for young people, is all the stuff that Dante and Emma have been talking about, about what's the actual risk today of things like accidental detonations, things like fissional material in the wrong hands, these kind of questions. I think there's just a huge lack of awareness. And if you were able to make a game that enacted that and showed some of the consequences of that in a way that was really engaging and frankly fun, because that is part of the equation here, I think then that would go a long way toward handing this problem over to the youth and saying, be aware of it, we're counting on you to solve it.
Awesome. And speaking of fun, we have, just for St. Patrick's Day, we have a very green version of Farshad Farahat. So Farshad, from whatever leprechaun place that you're inhabiting right now, what would you tell us to do if we could do anything at all with media?
I don't know what happened to my feed, but anyway, again, to piggyback on what MJ said and what Dante said, I mean, something that a game or social media content that could engage the public here and there about national security. I mean, like Dante would say, in sports events, you always see the army right before every game, which is great. But I would love to see diplomats or the strength of diplomacy before every game. So some sort of bit that would run, or a game that would run, that would connect the people to the other side and show the strength of diplomacy, and also get our people involved in national security. We're told that the only way is through war and armies. And I think a lot of Americans should find out that there's an option with diplomacy. And so I'd love to see what we could do. If I was telling you guys, put some sort of social media or game together that introduces the concept of diplomacy rather than war and ultimate form of war as nuclear weapons.
I'm sitting right next to the board game version, the board game called Diplomacy. So thanks for that, Farshad. Maybe we need to pull that back out and see what we might do with that idea. Thanks for that. And so we're going to come to you, Erica, and then John. So Erica and then John, you just jump right in.
Sure. Yeah, I love Farshad's idea about really shifting the focus, and I think I definitely would build on that. I mean, one of the things, and this is really sort of broad stroke and potentially a couple layers away, but I think that in our schools and in our kind of our systems of education, we need to have a much bigger commitment to emotional intelligence and emotional literacy, and helping people to really embrace and embody kind of a different language around how we communicate with each other. And I think, that's a big picture perspective, but I feel like really it connects to what Farshad said about shifting the focus on the role of our politicians and the role of diplomacy, and what peace really means, what a different kind of peace means versus one that's peace because of the threat of war.
Yeah, and for me, I think that I love the ideas that are coming out here, and I think some of it would be incredibly engaging. But I guess as a data person, I'm going to still say that it's important that whatever idea that we have, that we are, we've come up with the metrics that can measure it relatively quickly. Technology allows us to do that, and make sure that we continuously improve the messaging or the relevance that we have, whether it's a game or any kind of other type of outreach that we have. And for this organization to use, to use technology in a way to validate what's working and what's not working. I think that there is a lack of awareness on this topic, especially amongst the millennials today. So there is a way of communicating it that we haven't figured out yet, that's buried in big data somewhere. I think it's somewhere there that we can find. In order for us to get to the influence, we're going to have to understand how to communicate that. What language to use, what storytelling methods that we need to use. That's all buried in big data as well. I'm going to tell you one thing. I mean, in different types of kind of research that we've done, for example, on a totally different topic like reproductive rights, we've learned by just asking the millennials for visual depictions of reproductive rights that they are completely turned off by scare tactics that we used to use in the 80s, and that we continue to use still. If you look at political ads in the last campaign, the women's rights group came in with all very scare tactics in regards to that topic, and it was a big turnoff to the audience, especially the millennials. We cannot fall into that same trap with this type of a topic, and it's very easy to get access to that kind of information, and technology allows it. And I hope that, and it's not even that costly because of the improvements in technology. So I hope that we're able to use that. So whatever effort that a great group of people like this, put into whatever campaign it is something that we know will resonate out with the bigger audience in the world.
Well, thanks, John. And let me just say very quickly before I hand this over to Emma to give us our takeaways from this episode, that we are going to be transcribing every one of these conversations and poring over all of the comments from this episode and from all the others, because there are such great nuggets, such great strands for us to pull on, ideas for us to think about funding going forward. And I just want to thank all of you for being so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emma Belcher and your thoughts about what happened here today.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Erica. And I'd just like to echo Erica's thoughts and say thanks so much for all of the effort you've put into this and the great ideas that have come out. And, when I think about my takeaways, I've got a couple. One is that we really need to take a systems approach to all of this. And we need to try and create experiences that tap into emotions. And I think first we started talking about emotions that were more positive kind of emotions that many people would associate with positive feelings. That is sort of creating empowerment, tapping into people's values, and then providing opportunities to be empathetic with others. And so I think that's something that is a really positive way of going forward. And I also think that something that MJ said was particularly interesting as well, which is you can also create sort of feelings for people that make them a bit uncomfortable, that maybe make them deal with sort of moral choices. And I think that's good because I think that's not such a bad or a negative emotion. I think that's really something that can challenge us, but it's not a sort of a scare tactic. And by, I think, putting people in that situation, having them maybe in a game where they're making choices, we're maybe giving people more of a sense that they have some kind of ownership over where things are going, so that it can actually, what they do and think can make a difference. And having said that, I think Erica really challenged us as an expert community and as a funder group to think about, okay, what is it that, what's the ask here? So, all right, we've got great examples of how we can reach people and sort of tap into emotions, but what do we want them to do with that? And I think the more specific we can get about that and the more ideas we can have, I think the better and the more impactful we're going to be. So I think it's a challenge for us to think about that, but as we've heard from John and MJ as well, we can actually really test the waters as we go. So we can sort of find out what's working and what's not, and sort of make course corrections and readjust, or potentially throw new things into games. So I think what I've come away from this session with is a more positive view about, okay, where might we go? How might we sort of have some kind of impact at reaching millennials? And that there does seem to be an opportunity not to just scare people so that they ignore the issue. So thanks very much.
Wow, and we're at the end of our time, unfortunately. It's been an awesome conversation like all the previous four, and we are now at the point where we're going to be heading into our final roundtable of the entire series in a couple weeks from now. But in the meantime, by the end of the week, we'll basically have a 10-minute video edited on this. We'll have a 2-minute video for social media. We'll have write-ups on this. We'll take some of the social media and work that into our coverage. And so what I just want to say right now is, the founder of Reinventors, thanks to everyone, and yet another fantastic session. Thank you.